Hi there. Welcome to the Sober Circle channel. Enjoy this speaker tape.
I'd like to thank Chuck for recognizing me last night. I thought I deserved it, and I appreciate it. I hope that I can say to Dave Rozier what he said to me last night. I said, Dave, you did a fine job chairing the meeting last night. He said, I thought so too. This is a new experience for me this morning. I've had the pleasure of introducing many people before. But, I've been introduced to many judges, but this is the first time I've ever had the privilege of introducing a judge. I met our speaker at a Southeastern convention in New Orleans. I believe it was 1952. And this was the first convention that he'd ever spoken on. And I was really impressed with the man. He meant much to me then, and he's meant more over the years. Our speaker last night was the first man to tell me that I had to clean up on the inside. And our speaker this morning was the first man that ever told me that I could be a gentleman doing it. Truly, this is one of the finest men I have ever met. He's been active in all facets of AA since he came in. To me, he is a great credit to Alcoholics Anonymous. He is the type of man that we can introduce to anyone and be proud to do it. I've heard him many times, and I get much out of his talks. He's the first man that I ever heard really talk about his family. The amends that we can make to our families. And he has a real message for us. And if you haven't heard him, listen close. And if you have heard him, listen a little closer, because there's a great message here for us. And it was a great deal of pleasure that I introduced to you Judge Bob T., Gulfport, Mississippi.
Well, my name is Bob T., and I am an alcoholic. I'm going to try in a general way this morning, if I can, to talk about that beautiful rendition of Chapter 5 by Dave Orr last night. I may just hit it in the high places, but I'll still try. Dave really read that thing like I've always thought it ought to be read. It's just that simple. Rarely have we ever seen anyone fail who has really tried to follow our path. And I believe that with all my heart. Now, I'm an alcoholic, but the first time I ever heard I was an alcoholic, my wife called me one. And it made me so mad that I guess I proved I was one by going out and getting drunk. You see, at that time I thought that an alcoholic was a low-down drunken bum lying in the gutter. And since I had my head up on the curb, I thought there was a great deal of difference. Today the word has a far different connotation. And I won't go into all that it means, but I hope that it appears in what I am trying to say. People often wonder just exactly what this strange individual, the alcoholic, is, and just what the disease of alcoholism is. And we say very simply that we suffer from a mental obsession that compels us to take the drink, and from a physical lethargy that once having taken that drink condemns us to keep on drinking until we go insane or die. And though you can read the medical definition of it, it all adds up to that, because really and truly the doctors are not quite convinced on just what it is. In the Powell case that went to the United States Supreme Court in 1968, I think that the only reason we lost on a 5-4 decision was because the court said that the doctors themselves did not seem to be able to agree precisely what we are suffering from. They all agreed that we were suffering, and that somebody ought to do something about it, but they didn't know yet just exactly what it was we were suffering from. So, with that, we have to go along, and we run into a question of a lot of definitions about what is an alcoholic, and you get your listener confused as well as being confused yourself. One definition that I heard trying to make a distinction between a psychotic and an alcoholic was that a psychotic believes that 5 plus 4 equals 10. The alcoholic knows better than that. He knows that it only equals 9, but it worries him a great deal. A boy from out in Chuck's country, I think, gave the very best definition that I ever heard. At least it's the one that I understand better than any other one, and that is this: that if a normal individual were to go out of the door to my right, and there was a man standing there with a baseball bat who knocked him down every time he came out, he would eventually get the idea he should go out this door. But not the alcoholic. He'll still go out that door, and if the man with the baseball bat's not there, he'll wait for him. As we heard so beautifully expressed last night, we suffer from a threefold illness. We are ill physically, we are ill mentally, and most of all, we are ill spiritually. And it is because the treatment in Alcoholics Anonymous keeps those three things in balance, I think, that causes the signal success of Alcoholics Anonymous in this field. But we alcoholics don't start out to be alcoholics. I have never in my life known an alcoholic who chose to arrive at that unfortunate position. But nevertheless, though it's a consummation that about not to be wished for, we arrive, and we arrive, we think, very suddenly. We don't think about all the number of years that have come about in which we started drinking so innocently and thought it was such a nice thing to do. And then one day we decided that we'd cross back to that social drinking that we loved so much at the outset. And to our consternation and sometimes to our horror, we find out that we can't cross back. We've crossed over the line to a point of no return. And for us, if we are to be sober and to be happy the balance of our lives, we must exclude alcohol from it, because we suffer from a terrible, insidious illness. An illness that we can't understand, but the illness that in time winds each individual, I think, up into a little cocoon of his own making. And in that little small world that we create, when we are under the influence of whatever our poison may be, we are masters and kings and queens of all that we survey. The trouble is we don't survey so very much. And so someday we must break out of that shell. And I found out for myself that it was easier, much easier, to act myself into right thinking than it was to think myself into right acting. And I think that that's necessary for the alcoholic if he or she is going to achieve sobriety, to make the total commitment that is necessary to be made in Alcoholics Anonymous. Now we have some wonderful friends on the outside about whom we seldom speak, and yet those friends have looked at us with a great deal of understanding and have been with us from the very outset. And they believe that the four basic principles of Alcoholics Anonymous, the things that keep you and me sober, are these. The first one is knowing ourselves. It was quite a revelation to me to look down into my life and see what was in old Bob's life, and it was not a pleasant thing to do. But that is the opening door that makes you and me come to the conclusion that we must make this commitment. And the second principle that they have is fellowship. A wonderful word, and yet a cold word, to really express all that we find and all the love that we have for each other in this program, in the love for the program and in the love for each other in the program. Even though you may not like some of them, you still must love them. And then the third one is working with others. The lifeblood of Alcoholics Anonymous is gratitude. If it were not so, it would have been gone a long time ago, this question of a way of life for men and women. It can thrive and it can exist only upon the gratitude that one man or woman has for what has been given to him or them so freely, that they turn around and ask, well, what can I do to you to pay for what you've done for me? And they say, you can't pay us anything. But if you feel that there is a debt, then go out and help the suffering alcoholic who's still out there, and who but for you and me and others like us will surely die unless someone can carry the message to them. And the fourth principle is a spiritual faith. A spiritual faith. Dr. Samuel Shoemaker, one of our great friends who's passed on now, but for many years was head of Calvary Church there in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, said that the wisest thing Alcoholics Anonymous ever did was when, in step 3, we did not undertake to define God. I believe at that time it was claimed that there were 302 different religions. And if we had undertaken to define God, it would have been just one more, 303. But because we didn't do that, the canopy has become so broad that men and women of all faiths, or indeed of no faith at all, can come here and can find relief and release from their suffering. We must remember that in the valley there are many, many roads, but all of them have to lead to only one apex, and that apex is God. God as you understand Him, and God as I understand Him. But as I stand up here and begin talking to you in a somewhat philosophical vein about this, the thought occurred to me that perhaps there may be a few out there that think that the committee made a mistake in bringing me up here, because I am not qualified to stand up here and talk to you. So I would like to talk just a little bit about some of my experience to let you know that I haven't been misplaced on this program in the slightest this morning. About 8 years, the best I can remember, I'm troubled with that same kind of memory that Willard has. About 8 years before I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, things were coming to a terrible pass, I thought, in my home, and my wife had known that for quite a number of years. And on this particular occasion, as usual, I was terribly drunk. And she went to my former law partner, who was a federal judge in our district until he died a couple of years ago. And all he could do was to give her sympathy, and she was overloaded with that already. And she tried my brother in Jackson, who was an engineer and who has since passed away. But he refused to come, and he says, I'm sorry, but when he gets to drinking, he goes crazy. And he's going to hurt someone, and I don't want to be the one to get hurt. And then she thought about my younger brother, who was a judge, one of these corporation judges, Dave, corporate judges, that is, city judge, in Corpus Christi, Texas. And he came over, and with a valor born of ignorance, he waded in and proceeded to take charge of the situation. And the next thing I knew, I was headed for one of these institutions. But just shortly prior to that, which brought things to begin to bring them to a screaming halt, which took about 8 years to arrive there, she was in desperation then. And she went to the doctor to get somebody to prescribe something that would get me under the influence of something that would keep me quiet and asleep for a while. And finally, she got one doctor who later became a brother of ours, and he prescribed. And because it may be that some of you have never heard about these things, I would like to go into that with just a little bit of detail. He sent a box out there of little red capsules that doctors call secanols. They've gone out of style almost now, though they're mighty effective. The profane call them red devils. And it had on there these directions, that upon retiring, to take one. If sleep had not been attained in 4 hours, to take another, but no more. My wife, being the trusting soul that she was at that time, let me keep the whole box. So I immediately retired. And you alcoholics know how time passes. In 15 minutes, I was ready to take a paralyzed oath that 4 hours had passed, and so I took another, and then another, and another, and then one more. And I just wasn't getting any action or reaction out of those things at all. And the brilliant thought occurred to me that perhaps a half a tumbler of good bourbon whiskey would expedite that procedure. And so I took it. And about 2:30 in the morning, my wife heard the crash. Now, in our home, in the dining room, we have a dining room table like most do. And this one happened to have 4 corners on it. And it had some little pieces of wood that ran laterally to a common center and were just a little bit above the floor. In fact, the distance from the bottom of those things to the floor was a little bit less than the distance between my 2 ears. But my head was hung under that thing. And my wife came in, and she began tugging and pulling and jerking, and I tried to do the same. And finally, with a little skin and blood coming through the rye, we got my head out. And by that time, she was thoroughly disgusted with the proceedings. And she says, well, Bob, for goodness sake, stand up. I said, well, now, my dear, if you will just explain to me which way is up, I'll try to make it. She grabbed me by my pajama coat as though I had a bad case of leprosy. And I crawled on my stomach through 3 rooms, and when my bed came by, I nailed it. It was under those conditions that this brother of mine, my youngest brother, came over from Corpus to help out. And the next thing I knew, I was headed toward one of these institutions that some of you may be familiar with. And I told him and I told my wife, I said, if you send me to one of these places where they've got locks on the doors and bars on the windows. There will be a day when I get out, and when I do, I'm coming to see both of you. And they said, no, that's not so. Said, where you're going, you can come and go just as free as you want to. I said, well, I just don't believe it. So the old gentleman, the doctor whom I supported for the next 8 years, got on the phone there, and he said, yes, my boy, you come up here, and we're going to take care of you, and you can come and go just as free as a bird. And when I got there, I found out that he had literally told me the truth. I could come and go as free as a bird if I was willing to travel with no more clothes on than a bird had on. I was so filled with humiliation over the shame and disgrace that I felt I had brought upon my wife and my 2 daughters, all 3 of whom are very lovely, that I made up my mind I'd never take another drink as long as I lived. And so for 3 days and 3 nights I refused all forms of sedation, and I refused any whiskey to taper off on. I just didn't know as much about it then as I do now. Oh, I'd never made that mistake. And the 3rd night I went into delirium tremens. And for 3 more days and nights they fought pretty hard to save my life. And it would serve no useful purpose to regale you this morning with what goes on when you're in delirium tremens. But it's like the old country boy said, if you ain't been there, you ain't seen nothing yet. You just exactly what he's talking about. To be in that never, never land where you're half sane and half insane, and you don't know which time is which, is an agony that the human mind cannot long endure. But fortunately and miraculously, they pulled me out. And I lingered at that institution to take all that they had to offer. Because when I found out what had happened, during all the 3 nights that they said I was in DT, it scared me. And I took the full course, which wound up with the housing treatment, which, if some of you don't know anything about that, is a method by which you learn how to walk on walls and ceilings with no effort at all. And finally, when I got ready to leave, the doctor discharged me as cured. He said if I had $5 more, he would give me a diploma that said I was cured, and I told him no, I'd take his word for it. And I came back to Gulfport, and I gathered up the very badly scattered reins of my law practice. They got to where they'd let me eat at the table with them again at home. And the dog got to where they'd quit growling at me when I came in at night. And I began to think that life was rosy and worthwhile and very beautiful. And I lived that way for a matter of 6 months, and I'd see some of those idiots around Gulfport just slogging it down and getting drunk. And I just said, well, that's not for me. I'm cured. And then I got to wondering about my constitutional rights. And I thought, well, now it's not going to hurt for me to take just 1 or 2 little drinks, particularly if I drink like a gentleman, however that is. And so I took me just 2 little old drinks, and in 24 hours they had me back in that institution tied down to a bed. And then back and forth I went until I just became a sanitarium commuter. Until finally I wore out my welcome and my pocketbook at that institution. And it seemed to me that the welcome expired coincidentally with the pocketbook given out. And then my wife decided that I needed a change of scenery, so we moved to Foundation Hospital in New Orleans. Well, Foundation Hospital in New Orleans cares as little about a drunk as any hospital that I know of anywhere. But it's owned and controlled by Oxner Clinic, which was founded by 5 men, and 2 of those 5 men were schoolmates of mine at the University of Mississippi. And so I got in under a diagnosis of incipient diabetes, but just as drunk as a lord. Now, one psychiatrist, as fine as many of them are, one psychiatrist, I believe, is enough in any one person's life. But my wife decided that I needed 4. And there I was laying on the little white bed, shaking and shivering and sweating all at the same time as only an alcoholic can. And those four learned men came in and looked down at me like a group of scientists looking at an insect under a microscope, and said, "What do you propose to do about your problem?" I said, "Problem? I don't quite understand you. I'm slightly drunk. I thought everybody knew that, and I don't really have diabetes. That's just the way I got in here. The only problem I got is to get sober enough to try a lawsuit in Biloxi next Thursday. Now, if you can solve that one, you've got mine solved." And without one more word, all four of them turned around and walked out into the hall where my anxious and tearful wife was awaiting the verdict of the jury. And they said, "We're awfully sorry, but he doesn't have the right attitude." And all we can foresee for you is a continuous round of these institutions until finally he'll develop the wet brain, and then you can put him in an asylum and go home and rest, know where he is for a change. Up until that time, I'd sworn off as many times as any man under the sound of my voice, and the strange thing was that every time I convinced my wife that this was really it, this was the last time, she always would hail the news to the neighborhood, particularly all of her dear anxious friends, and a close friend of hers who had a husband that was in as bad shape as I was, and she'd say, "Well, I think it's just fine, and I wish you'd go up and tell Charlie what you found." And I knew better than tell Charlie what I'd found, because I knew what Charlie's language was going to be, and I didn't care to be insulted so fluently, and I left him alone. In May of 1949, the lawyers in my state conferred upon me the highest office in our power to give. I was elected president of the Mississippi State Bar. And by all the rules of the game, that ought to have been enough to have kept me sober during the greater part of my tenure in office. But I was drunk in less than 2 weeks' time. And I woke up the next morning, and I had a hangover. It felt like I'd have to take a crowbar to reach out and scratch my head. It felt so big. And then my wife came in and wanted to talk to me. I don't know whether any of you have experienced it, but it always looked like when you were dying for one more slug of whiskey, they want to sit down and discuss the facts of life. And they said, "Well, the children and I just don't think you're going to quit. And whether you believe it or not, we don't want to be here and see that. So we're going to leave you and let you have it. And we're going outside of Gulfport to get a lawyer to represent us in a fair division of what's left." I said, "Well, I can't blame you, and I won't stand in your way. But you won't have to go outside of Gulfport to get a lawyer to represent you. I'll represent you. And I will do more for you and the children than any court would require me, more than any judge would require. If you'll just call the girl from the office right now, I will dictate and execute an announcement by which I will give you and the children everything in the world I possess except one suit of clothes, and I'll leave." And she stood there literally aghast. And she said, "Bob, you just can't mean that you'd give the children and me everything in the world that you have, but you won't turn loose a bottle of whiskey." And I said, "I can't turn loose a bottle of whiskey." And I think then my wife realized how terribly ill I was, because like so many fine women in AA, she stuck, and she stuck all the way. Things have come into a terrible climax in my life, and I was aware of everything except that alcohol was causing it. My old law partner, the judge, drove out one day, and I was, of course, in my pajamas, which I usually stayed in most of the time. And he said, "Would you like to go for a little ride?" And I said, "Yes, I would, Judge." So he got me out, and he said, "Now, Bob, you don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to, but in all the years we practiced, I don't think you ever told me a lie in the world. I said, well, I hope not. I tried not to. But said, you know, I've got a brother that drinks just like you do, and I don't understand him any more than I understand you. But I wish you would tell me, really, what makes you drink like you do. And I said, well, now, Judge, I'll tell you. I wouldn't tell everybody this, but I think that I'm going nuts. And he said, well, I do too. And that shook me up considerably. I thought the language was going to be, well, no, Bob, with a fine brain like yours, you'll last forever. Just slow down. But no, he didn't. He really thought I was going nuts, and I was convinced I was. My drunks were getting more frequent. The recovery period was taking longer, and the suffering was much, much greater. And still I couldn't see the thing. And then here came in a bootlegger to my office, whom I had defended times without number for a little cash money and a whole lot of his very excellent product. And he said, Mr. Bob, I want to talk to you about something that's strictly none of my business. I said, well, Pete, don't let that stop you a bit in the world. Lots of people have been talking about something that's strictly none of their business about my life, and you go ahead. He said, well, you know, you come out to my place with your foxhound and that big bay horse, and you're loaded to the gills when you get there, and you turn the hounds loose, and they go down through those hills and hollows, and they do that job fine. But that's cut-over land down there, and it's got lots of holes in it. And you get on this big bay horse, usually with my help, and then you cut her loose, wide open right down there in the dark, and says that horse is going to hit one of those holes one of these days, and he's going to break his neck. And he's a fine horse. And I hate to see him die. And he says, I think you're a fine man, and I hate to see you die. Don't you think you're drinking too much? I said, well, Pete, I tell you, I'm one of those fellows that can take it or leave it any time I want to. And if it's going to worry you, I'll leave it for a while. He said, well, maybe I shouldn't have come, but I'm glad I said what I did. Then he left. And then I got to thinking, well, now, if the bootleggers in Harrison County are getting concerned about my sobriety, perhaps it's time for me to get concerned about it. And then the solution to my whole problem appeared right under my nose, and to be honest about it, I was a little embarrassed at my stupidity in not having thought about it sooner. All in the world I had to do to stop my drinking was find out which one of these drinks was getting me drunk and stop on the preceding drink. I was hoping, of course, that it was going to be about the 6th or 7th. I wanted to be about the 16th or the 17th. But if it was the 6th or 7th, I was going to make the supreme sacrifice and do it. So nothing would do but for me to make the noble experiment. And I loaded up my foxhound, some old charter whiskey, some coffee and sandwiches, and fared forth for the noble experiment. Now, some of you boys, particularly from the wilderness, I hope you never get drunk again, but if you do, let me recommend a pack of foxhounds for drinking companions. They will go with you anywhere in the world you want to go. They'll stay with you as long as you want to stay. They won't drink any of your whiskey, and most of all, they will not criticize your conduct. And so I took them out. And in due course, I passed out. And the next morning, when I came to, one lousy hound was in. He'd quit the race during the night. But the others were in full cry, and I did what any good foxhunter would do then. I reached over for another drink. And I found out that just about that much left in the bottle. And so I repaired back about 2.5 miles to a little restaurant, got the man to fix up a little food for me, and got refurbished with some liquor. And after I drank about a half a tumbler, which was the usual drink, I thought, well, here I am, just about as drunk as I usually am. I came out here for only one purpose, and that's to find out which drink got me drunk. And I declare I don't know which one it was. I can't remember. I know, of course, this morning that it was the first drink that got me drunk. And so I said, may I use your telephone? And I called the man who had come in to talk to me about my problem, a lifelong friend. And I all but threw him out of a fourth-floor window for his insolence, and assuming that I was a drunkard and an alcoholic besides. Just getting drunk was bad enough, but when he said I was an alcoholic too, I thought that was too much, and I told him, I said, Charlie, you stay down there with Alcoholics Anonymous where you belong. You're not misplaced at all. But I can't imagine myself going down there and being associated with a bunch of drunks. But I called Charlie that morning, and I said, Charlie, if this AA business means what you say, you come and get me because I'm not going to get home. I'm afraid today by myself. And he said, well, Bob, I cannot be out there under 2 hours, but if you can hold on that long, I'll be there for sure. I said, well, that'll be all right, and you'll find me out there on the advanced school road just across Big Biloxi River, piled up with the hounds at that place where we used to bird hunt. And that proved to be more prophetic than I intended for it to. They say that they pulled 4 hounds off of me before they got to me. And they carried me home, and they announced the joyful news to my wife that Bob was going to join AA, and we're going to sober him up the AA way. And she raised her eyebrows slightly at that last remark because she thought that she had helped pay for every way known to mankind to sober a drunk, but she was not one to quibble with miracles. And she said, well, you gentlemen, take him. I'm going over to my aunt's. There's plenty of coffee, and there's plenty of food here, and there's plenty of bed. And when the miracle has come to pass, let me know that I also may see. And on the second morning, not having gotten the word, she came over, and there I was, drunker than when we started. She said, well, I tried to tell you, gentlemen, that he's one of these formaldehyde babies. He has been to the hospital so long he's become thoroughly institutionalized, and we'll just have to take him back to the hospital. I said, well, we'd be glad to do that for you. She said, no, you don't have to do that. That an old doctor gave me the recipe long years ago, and Bob knows that I can take a pint of Old Taylor and lead him to the very gates of hell without a struggle, and I'll take him by myself. And so we did. And, of course, my wife was exceedingly sarcastic on that occasion now. I couldn't blame them. But we were going up the road in Hattiesburg. She said, Bob, we're about to pass Mississippi Southern. Barbara, our younger daughter, has a whole lot of friends up here, and I want you to lay down on the floor so that nobody can know that you're anywhere around. I said, well, now, my dear, I'll be glad to do that. But if that's the way you're going, we're not going to ever reach the hospital. She said, why? I said, because you missed the road where you should turn way back there about 2.5 miles. But if you will permit me, after you get beyond the hospital, to raise my head, I will give you directions, as drunk as I am, that will get us there. And so we did, and I said, now when you get to certain street there at the Citizens Bank building, turn to your left. And I just computing the time, thought that it was taking an unnecessarily long time, and I raised my head up, and I saw Proggy Khan's electric shop. I said, you just missed the road again, honey. Now, if you'll permit me, just turn to your left here at this hotel and go down that alley road, and you'll come out on that other road that says Highway 11, and for God's sake, don't take your eyes off of it until we get there. So we got there. And the old doctor whom I had supported so long, and who had let me get sober most any way I wanted to, as long as I had a little cash to pay for it, looked over his glasses and his big pot tummy and said, well, big boy, how do you want it this time? And I said, well, doctor, I've had enough. My wife and children are going to leave me. My law practice is in terrible shape. I don't have any more friends left. But most of all, I've lost my own self-respect. And I want you to get me sober the quickest way you know how. And I'm going to try this thing called Alcoholics Anonymous. So he put me on formaldehyde for 2 nights. My wife stayed with me. We went in on Monday, and on Wednesday, about 11 o'clock, they let me out. My head was clear, but oh, how I was shaking and vibrating. And the next night was Thursday night. And the closer it got, the more worried I became about my promise to join Alcoholics Anonymous. And I began to try to hedge. And my wife and Charlie said, no, you promised that you're going, so let's go. So I went. And up until that time, I had not known where Alcoholics Anonymous met in Gulfport, Mississippi. But as we proceeded up the steps, I recognized it as a former funeral home. And I thought, well, how exceedingly appropriate this is. And I went in and I took a seat in the very back of the room, right up against the wall with my head down. And I held myself like this to keep my hands from flying off into outer space. I didn't hope that nobody recognized me. I hadn't come to see anybody. And then 2 men talked. And the first man talked about his daughter, Patsy, who wanted to have a birthday party, and her mother told her that she may. And she ran off to invite her little friends, and they ran off to get permission from their parents and came back dragging their feet. And they said, Patsy, we are sorry, but our parents say that your father is a drunkard and we can't come in your home. And it nearly broke that child's heart. And I could understand that because I had seen my own 2 girls more than one night lock themselves in each other's arms and cry themselves to sleep because their father was drunk. And I, like the drunken, stupid fool that I was, could only stand there and suffer the pangs of bitter remorse. And I just wondered if it wouldn't be better for me to take myself out of this vale of tears. And I'm not prepared to argue this morning whether I would have or not. But I do believe with all my heart that there's many a fine man and woman who lie this morning stilled in death by their own hand because they believed it was the last decent thing left to do. And the other man got up to talk. And he talked about his 2 boys being called by the bartender at Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, saying, for goodness sake, come down here and get the old man out. He's running our business. And when you are enough drunkard to run the business of a saloon in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, you are some drunkard. And I began to listen to the man with increased respect. And after I heard both of those talks, I went home and my whole sordid life passed before my eyes in kaleidoscopic review. And I decided that night that I was going to give Alcoholics Anonymous a fair shake.
Please stop.
And I've given AA a fair shake since that time, and it's paid me off very wondrously in dividends. The first thing that I learned was the beauty of the 24-hour program. I learned that yesterday, with all of its failure, its fear, its despair, and its bitter remorse, is gone, and it's gone forever. And neither you nor I, nor any other living person can call back one single fleeting moment. It's gone. And tomorrow is yet unborn. But today is here, the ever-glorious present. It's here for you and me to take and shape into something fine and beautiful, or to throw it away and make it just another yesterday. And the choice lies entirely with you and me. A little verse from the Sanskrit very beautifully expresses that thought, I believe, when it said, look to this day, for it is life, the very life of life. For yesterday is already a dream, and tomorrow is only a vision. But the day well lived makes every yesterday a dream of heaven, and every tomorrow a vision of hope. So look well to this day. So I started out, and I don't have the time to talk about my girls this morning, though I would like to very much, but I'll try to pass on. I began to put myself into this AA program. The book says that a talk in AA should say what we were and what happened and what we're trying to be now. And so following that, I'm going to try. When I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, I was just a half-baked agnostic. I wasn't an atheist because I think it takes a little bit too much mental agility to be one, and I wasn't that agile. And so I came in not believing anything at all. In the years, you know, way back, John, as far as I can remember back, I used to be superintendent of a Sunday school for a while. And I thought I had learned a good deal then about the Bible and a lot about life. But after I left, I got away from that. And I got on this philosophical kick. And I studied, didn't read, I studied all of the great philosophies. I read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason 4 times. And I don't understand that thing, and I don't believe Kant ever really understood it. But I took them all, including the General Spinoza and others who were really very good in parts, but they never could give you a complete answer to life itself. And so I decided that I was going to have a mental catharsis and get rid of that, and I did. I discarded every bit of it that I'd ever read, except 3 philosophies. The first one was by a Greek, the second one was by a Roman, and the third was by a Jew. And the Greek old Socrates went about inquiring into the minds and hearts of men and women in order that he might understand them and help them understand themselves. And all of his philosophy to me is expressed in the words, to know thyself. And the old Roman Marcus Aurelius, an old man deeply steeped in the old Stoic philosophy, who taught moderation and self-control in all of your dealings with your fellow man. And to me, at least, his philosophy is expressed in 2 words, to control thyself. And the third was Jesus of Nazareth, who came upon this earth and who taught men and women the true meaning of self-denial, that in self-abnegation might we find true humility. And to me, at least, his philosophy was expressed in 2 words, deny thyself. And when you have the 3, to know thyself, control thyself, and deny thyself, what more or what less do you have than the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous? And so I began. And I began doing whatever was necessary to do. I began to take the long, painful, tortuous road toward the understanding of a higher power. And it's been long, and it's been tortuous, and it's been painful, but I think that that is really the only way that one can arrive at an understanding of a higher power. And I think that if everything that is good in AA could be gotten in just one fell swoop, it would not be worth the reaching for. It's in the long, hard struggle that we have to make, that we come into an understanding of this power that is greater than we are, and which we choose to call God, as we understand Him. And I found out that the medicine that Alcoholics Anonymous has, and the only medicine that is ever needed or ever will need, is nothing more nor less than the love and the grace of God. And to my dear brothers and sisters in AA here this morning, let me say that neither you nor I have ever deserved or merited 1 minute God's love or God's grace, but it came to us, and it came to us as free as spring water. And so I began with that, and I have tried through the years to try to live that as fully as I can. I know that as fine as the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is, we cannot go out and try to reach the world or touch the world, but we have a segment of humanity that has been carved out of those people who suffer like you and I suffer, who live on the fringe of life and on the edge of time. And who but for us and others like us shall surely die unless they get the message of Alcoholics Anonymous and of what God's great love and grace can be. And I believe with all my heart that to every alcoholic we have been entrusted something that had not been given to the rest of the world. It hasn't been given to the doctors. It hasn't been given to the clergymen, to the men of science. It hasn't been given to those who love us best to reach the lowly alcoholic. It has been given to us, the lowly alcoholics, by God as a trust that through us God's great love and grace may reach the suffering alcoholic man or woman who lies there on the couch or the bed. And some say and have said so often, what do you mean by a spiritual awakening? I don't know. I'm not qualified to define that, and I won't attempt to this morning. But I do say that when we go to the bedside of a man or woman in the throes of alcoholism, out of whose eyes have gone all hope of life, and we sit there and humbly and awkwardly sometimes try to tell our own story of what we were and what happened and what we are now, or trying to be. And upon the coals, you see the spark light up once more, and trembling they place their hand in yours, and they cross over to firmer ground. If that's not a spiritual awakening, then I don't want one in this world. And I think that that is one of the great things that makes this fellowship what it is. And I've tried, I've failed, and I've failed 1,000 times, and I know that, but I've never lost the objective. And if we have to have an obsession, what could be a more magnificent obsession than to search for that goal, which is there before us so plainly all the way. And I think I can say this morning with Townsend that from out our bourne of time and place, though the flood may bear me far, I hope to meet my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. There are two great words, two very great words, that to me express the whole concept of Alcoholics Anonymous. And those two words are love and service. And I don't know of any better way to close than with the words from the prayer that all of us know so well. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is doubt, faith. And where there is despair, hope. And where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O Divine Master, let me not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we are born to eternal life.
How sweet it is. This concludes 21st Tennessee State Convention. Drive safely, have a good trip home. We'll see you in Gatlinburg next year. Thank you very much. If you'll stand, we'll close this meeting with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.